Char marks scarred the pine floorboards in two long streaks, where someone had dragged a heavy body toward the front door and then changed their mind. For 4 years, the neighbors on Sycamore Street in the mill town of Gray Hollow, Montana, had listened to the sounds coming from the Hargrave house and concluded that what happened behind those walls was not their business. But on the night the early October freeze drove a solitary man down from the Bitterroot Range, a man who had not spoken to another living soul in 11 months. Everything the town had decided to ignore came crashing into the open. Riva Hargrave was 23 years old and weighed 94 pounds. On the morning she married Doyle Hargrave, she had not always been that thin. There were photographs from before, taken at her family's small farm outside of Billings, showing a girl with strong arms from hauling water and thick hair, the color of dark honey, laughing at something off to the left of the frame. In those photographs, Riva Caldwell, she had been Caldwell then, looked like a person who fully intended to live a long time. The marriage had been her father's solution to a problem her father had created. Emmett Caldwell was not a cruel man, just a weak and frightened one, and perhaps that distinction matters very little to a daughter being handed over. He owed Doyle Hargrave $4,000 accumulated across 3 bad harvests and a cattle sickness that had taken half the herd in the summer of 1881. Doyle owned the grain elevator in Gray Hollow, the largest sawmill in Cascade County, and the only bank that would extend credit to a struggling farmer without demanding his land up front. He was 41 years old. He had been married once before. His first wife, a quiet woman named Hedda, had died of what the town physician recorded as a heart ailment in the winter of 1879. Those who had known Hedda well privately held their own opinions about what had strained her heart. But Gray Hollow was a town that valued its prosperity over its conscience, and Doyle Hargrave's mill employed 63 men. On their wedding day, Doyle wore a dove gray suit and stood very straight in the church. He had a fine, square jaw and dark eyes that caught the light pleasantly. The women of the congregation remarked afterward that Riva was a lucky girl. She had caught a man of substance. Her father had shaken Doyle's hand at the altar with an expression of visible relief. The first time was 3 weeks into the marriage. It was over the coffee. She had made it too weak or too strong. She could never afterward remember which, because the memory of the reason had been completely obliterated by the memory of the kitchen floor rising up to meet her face. He had not apologized. He had stepped over her, straightened his jacket, picked up his hat from the peg by the door, and gone to the mill. By the time he returned that evening, the coffee cup had been washed, the bruise on her cheekbone had begun to turn, and Riva had understood with terrible clarity that this was not an aberration. This was the arrangement. Doyle Hargrave was a methodical man. He kept ledgers of extraordinary precision at the mill and applied the same orderly mind to every aspect of his domestic life. He did not drink to excess. He did not gamble. He attended church on Sundays and contributed generously to the collection plate. When he struck Riva, there was rarely randomness to it. It was corrective, he told her. It was what a man owed himself when the order of his household fell below what he had paid for. He learned quickly which injuries would show and which would not. He learned the geography of concealment. Riva learned to move carefully, to speak carefully, to think carefully before doing anything at all, because anything at all could be the wrong thing. She learned to read the particular way he set his hat on the peg when he came in from the mill, because a hat hung precisely meant a manageable evening, and a hat tossed at the peg and missed meant she should send their one hired girl, a Scandinavian teenager named Astrid, home early. She tried once, in the 2nd year of their marriage. She had waited until Doyle was in Missoula on bank business, packed a small bag, and walked to the office of Sheriff Linus Craft, who had held the position for 19 years and whose family's flour account was maintained at Doyle's bank. Sheriff Craft had listened to her with the expression of a man being asked to adjudicate a dispute between a man and his boot. He had offered her a glass of water. He had walked her home in the gathering dusk, with a gentle hand at her elbow, and a gentle suggestion that marriage was a sacred covenant, and that she might consider whether she was fulfilling her side of it with sufficient attention. She was back in the kitchen when Doyle's wagon came up the road 2 days later, and from the way he looked at her when he walked through the door, she understood that the sheriff had telegraphed ahead. The beating she received that night left her unable to rise from the bed for 6 days. Doyle told the town she had influenza. He brought her broth in the evenings and sat in the chair beside the bed and talked to her pleasantly about the mill, about the weather, about an interesting article he had read in the Billings Gazette. The contrast was the most frightening thing, that he could move between the two versions of himself with such fluid ease. By the 4th year, Riva had stopped being frightened in the ordinary sense. Fright requires some residual belief that things could be different, and she had run out of that belief the way a lamp runs out of oil. She moved through her days in the dim, automatic way of someone who has made peace with a sentence. She had been a reader once, a borrower of books from the church lending shelf, a writer of long letters to a cousin in Ohio. She had not written a letter in 2 years. She had not read a book in longer. She was not sure when she had stopped, only that at some point the person who had enjoyed those things had stepped quietly out of her body and left the body to manage on its own. The night it ended began the way many bad nights began. Doyle had ridden out to a property dispute on a ranch he was in the process of acquiring through foreclosure and had returned in the tight, wordless fury that meant the negotiation had gone badly. The October wind had picked up by late afternoon, pushing the first genuine cold of the season down from the Bitterroot peaks and rattling the shutters of every house on Sycamore Street. Riva was at the stove. She heard his boots on the porch before the door opened, and in the 2 seconds between the sound of the boots and the sound of the latch, she assessed the dinner, assessed the kitchen, assessed herself, and found that it did not matter. When he was in this state, assessment was irrelevant. He moved through the doorway and did not remove his coat. He stood in the middle of the kitchen looking at her for a long moment, and then he hit her with the flat of his hand across the side of her head hard enough that she went sideways into the cast-iron stove. The pain that followed was not the worst she had ever felt, which was itself a measure of how far things had gone. She slid down to the floor and stayed there, and he stood over her and spoke to her in a low, even voice about her inadequacy, her worthlessness, her failure to justify what he had invested in her. He was precise, even in this. He grabbed her by the collar of her dress and dragged her toward the front door. He had done this before, threatened to put her out, to let the weather have her, to explain to the town in the morning that she had simply wandered off into the dark, and what could a man do? He threw back the bolt on the front door. He got the door open 2 inches against the wind, and then something came through it from the other side. The door did not break. He caught it, the man outside, but it was flung open with a force that sent Doyle stumbling backward across the kitchen, losing his grip on Riva's collar. She crumpled to the floor near the base of the stairs. The cold came in like a living thing, immediate and enormous, and in the doorway stood a shape that her dazed mind required several seconds to resolve into a man. He was very large. Not merely tall, but built in a way that suggested the Bitterroot range had been involved in his construction. Broad through the chest and shoulders, wrapped in a coat made of elk hide, so thick it moved like armor when he shifted his weight. Snow was still coming off him, melting into the kitchen floor. His face was heavily bearded, dark brown shot through with gray, and his eyes, when the lamplight caught them, were the flat, steady amber of a mountain lion's. He had a rifle across his back, a knife at his hip, and no expression on his face that Riva could immediately classify. His name was Jonas Blaine, though in the high country above the Bitterroot, where he spent the better part of each year running trap lines and wanting nothing from the world of men, most people simply called him Blaine. He had come down early from the peaks because the freeze had come early. A snap October cold that would freeze the passes shut within days, and he had supplies to trade and no interest in spending the winter at altitude without resupply. He had intended to cut through Grey Hollow to the trading post on the eastern edge of town, find a barn floor to sleep on, and be gone by first light. He had heard her from the street, not her voice. She had stopped making sounds that could be heard through walls a long time ago, because making sounds brought additional consequences. What he had heard was the particular impact of a body against a hard surface, a sound he knew from years of trapping, from seasons spent reading the wilderness, for the difference between a branch breaking in wind and a branch breaking under weight. That sound meant something alive was being damaged by something larger. He had heard it, and he had stopped walking, and he had stood in the freezing dark for exactly long enough to hear it again, and then he had stepped off the boardwalk and walked to the door. Doyle Hargrave recovered himself faster than some men would have. He was not physically timid. He had spent years overseeing a rough sawmill and understood that authority required demonstration. He straightened up and pointed at the doorway with the full weight of his name behind the gesture. "You have broken into my home," Doyle said. His voice was controlled. "I am Doyle Hargrave. I own this town's bank and its largest mill, and I will have you in irons before morning. Get out of my house!" Blaine looked at him. Then he looked at Riva on the floor. Then he looked at Doyle again. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. Doyle had time to reach the shelf where he kept a small revolver before Blaine's hand closed around his wrist. Not his throat, not dramatically, just his wrist, and applied a pressure that made the revolver drop to the floor with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Doyle swung with his free hand. Blaine took the blow on his forearm without seeming to notice it, turned Doyle's wrist to an angle it was not designed to achieve, and put him into the kitchen table. The table went over. Doyle Hargrave, the wealthiest and most consequential man in Cascade County, went with it. Blaine did not kick him while he was down. He stepped back. He looked at Doyle, who was clutching his wrist and breathing in the thin, careful way of someone with a newly broken bone, and he said, in a voice so quiet it barely cleared the sound of the wind, "If you get up, I'll put you back down, and the one after that will take longer to heal." He said it the way a man states a fact about the weather. Then he turned away from Doyle Hargrave entirely, as though the man had become a piece of furniture, and knelt beside Riva. She flinched. She could not help it. 4 years of conditioning is not undone by 3 seconds of witness, and her body moved away from the large hand coming toward her face before her mind could intervene. Blaine stopped his hand 6 inches from her face and held it there, open, not moving. "I'm not him," he said. It was not a reassurance exactly. It was simply a statement of fact, offered without ornamentation, the same way he had spoken to Doyle, and something about the plainness of it, the absence of the smooth, pleasant tone that Doyle used when he was performing normalcy, got through to her in a way that more elaborate comfort might not have. He pulled off the elk hide coat and draped it over her. The warmth still stored in the lining was immediate and shocking. It smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and the cold, clean air of high elevation, nothing like the interior of any room she had lived in for 4 years. She pulled it around her and felt, absurdly, that she had been handed something back that she had forgotten she was missing. "Can you stand?" he asked. "I think so. We need to leave this house. The men who do the sheriff's work in this town, are they the kind who'll ask questions or the kind who'll do what they're paid to do?" She looked at him. "The second kind." He nodded, unsurprised. "Then we leave now." "Where?" "Up," he said. "I have a camp. It's far enough that the weather will slow anyone who follows, and I know every foot of that terrain, and they don't." She looked at Doyle, who was on his side on the kitchen floor, making no move to rise, but watching them with eyes that held a dark and patient fury, the look of a man who is calculating rather than beaten. She had seen that look before. It was more frightening than his rage. She stood up. Her head swam. She took the coat tighter around herself and walked out of the house into the freezing Montana, dark, and she did not look back at the man on the floor, because she had spent 4 years looking at that man and she was done. Sheriff Linus Kraft arrived at the Hargrave house 20 minutes later, summoned by a neighbor who had seen the light pouring through the open front door. He found Doyle sitting in a kitchen chair with a self-applied splint on his right wrist, perfectly composed, prepared. By morning, a warrant had been drafted for the arrest of an unnamed mountain man for assault and abduction. By the following evening, Doyle had sent a telegram to Billings. The man who arrived by the next available coach was named Prescott Wade. He operated officially as a private investigator and had spent 12 years before that as a deputy marshal in territories where questions of method were not considered relevant to results. He was a lean, quiet man with a still face and small, close-set eyes that moved constantly. He sat across from Doyle Hargrave in the study and listened to the situation without expression. "The passes will close in another week," Doyle said. "Maybe 10 days. If you want to move, it has to be now. I'll need 3 men who know that range. I'll provide them, and I want cash up front. Half now, half when I bring her back." Doyle looked at him steadily. "And the mountain man?" Prescott Wade lifted one shoulder in a minimal shrug. "The warrant says assault. I'll bring him back to face charges." The way he said it made clear what facing charges was likely to mean for a man with no money and no name in Cascade County's legal system. "And if he resists?" Doyle asked. "Men in his situation often do," Prescott Wade said. The ascent from Gray Hollow to the camp below the tree line took Blaine and Riva the better part of 6 hours in the dark. Through game trails he navigated by memory and the particular angle of the wind off certain rock faces. He carried her for the last 3 of those hours, when her legs gave out from the cold and the blood loss she hadn't mentioned. She did not want to be carried. She told him so. "I know," he said, and carried her anyway. The camp was a trapper's structure built into a south-facing rock overhang. 1 room, thick log walls, a stone hearth, elk hides on a wooden frame for a bed, tools hung on pegs with the careful organization of a man who could not afford to lose anything. Blaine got a fire going within minutes and set a pot over it. He examined the cut on her temple, the angle of her ribs when she breathed. The bruising on her throat that she had forgotten was there, because it was simply the current layer on top of older layers. "You've got 2 ribs that are cracked, maybe 3, he said. "They'll heal if you don't push them. The cut needs cleaning. It's not the worst it's been." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said again quietly, and went to work with the same methodical gentleness he apparently applied to everything, cleaning the wound with water he'd boiled and strips of cloth from a kit he'd clearly assembled with some experience in field medicine. She slept for 16 hours. She woke to the smell of venison cooking and Blaine at the table, working a piece of leather with a bone tool. The snow outside the small window was a flat white wall. The passes would be closing. In the weeks that followed, the mountain imposed its particular discipline. There was wood to be split, traps to check, hides to cure, food to be stored. Blaine taught her as a matter of practical necessity, not as charity, not as a project, but because the camp required 2 capable people to run efficiently, and she was one of the 2 people available. He showed her how to set a snare, how to read ice for stability, how to bank a fire to last the night. Her hands, which had been soft in the way of a woman kept indoors, grew rough and then capable. She had been afraid that she would find the silence of it unbearable. She had expected the quiet of the high country to be oppressive in the way of a room with no windows. Instead, she found it was entirely different from Doyle Hargrave's silences, which had been silences full of threat, full of the constant work of anticipating what came next. The mountain's silence asked nothing of her. It did not keep score. In the evenings they talked. Not extensively, not in the way of people filling empty space, but in the way of 2 people who have decided cautiously that the other one is worth the risk of a sentence. She learned that Blaine had been a surveyor before the war, and a different kind of man after it, and that he had come to the Bitterroot looking for the specific peace available only to those who have decided they want very little from other people. He learned what had been done to her, not all at once, but in pieces, offered when she felt the weight of keeping them too much, and he received each piece without the expressions she had feared: pity, discomfort, the faint suggestion that perhaps she might have handled it differently. "People in that town knew," she said one night, watching the fire. "Yes," he said, "and they did nothing, no." She looked at him. "Does that bother you?" He was quiet for a moment. "What bothers me," he said, "is that a man like that gets to keep everything he's built on what he did to you and to that woman before you, while the town decides that what happens inside a man's walls is private business. It bothers me every time I see it, and I have seen it before." She had not expected that. The reference to Hedda, to the woman before her, to a pattern he had recognized without being told. She pulled her blanket tighter and looked into the fire. "He'll come for me," she said. "I know. When the pass is open. Yes, in the spring." He was working oil into a rifle stock with steady, even strokes. "By spring, we'll be ready." The winter moved at its own pace, indifferent to the human arrangements happening within it. Riva's ribs knit, the hollows under her cheekbones slowly filled. She stopped waking at night with her hands raised to protect her face. Not all at once, but gradually, the way a muscle relaxes when it has been clenched so long it has forgotten how to do otherwise. She began cautiously to recognize the person she had been in the photographs from Billings, to find that person was not gone, only buried, and that the mountain air, for all its cold, was doing something to the burial. In March, Blaine placed a Winchester rifle in her hands. "Spring is 6 weeks out," he said. "Maybe 8. Wade will come in with the first real thaw, and he'll have men who know how to track." She had held the rifle with the wariness of someone who has never been taught that she is allowed to defend herself. Blaine adjusted her grip and her stance with the same matter-of-fact patience with which he had shown her everything else. "You pull it to your shoulder like it belongs there," he said, "because it does. Exhale, then squeeze. Don't hold your breath. Don't rush." She practiced until the stock was familiar under her cheek, until the weight of it felt like something she had always carried rather than something borrowed. She practiced until she could put 3 rounds inside a 12-inch circle at 60 yards. And then she practiced until she could do it faster. "What if I can't?" she asked one afternoon, in the clear cold light of a March afternoon, with the snow still deep in the hollows. "Can't what? If he comes through that door? If it's Doyle or Wade or whoever he's paid? What if I can't do what I need to do?" Blaine was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the high pines above the camp. "Riva," he said, "the woman who couldn't do it is the one who stayed in that house and called it surviving. You are not that woman anymore." She looked at him, this man who had walked off a mountain in the dark and changed the course of things, and she thought that he was both right and wrong, that she was both women, the before and the after, carrying them both the way you carry scar tissue, and that this was not weakness but simply the truth of what surviving costs. The thaw came in the 2nd week of April. She heard the creek below the camp begin to run again, 3 days before Blaine said they would need to be watchful. He had set snares around the perimeter of the clearing, not to catch anything but to hear it. A length of gut strung between trees at boot height, tied to a series of small wood pieces that would clatter against the cabin's outer wall. On the 14th of April, before first light, the clatter came. Blaine was on his feet with the rifle before Riva had fully processed the sound. He moved to the window and looked out into the gray pre-dawn light, and then looked back at her, and the look told her everything. 2 on the ridge. At least 1 more on the approach. Prescott Wade is the kind who uses the high ground. Where's Doyle? Can't see him yet, he'll hang back. He's not a brave man. He's a man who pays other men to do the parts that require courage. He was right. Doyle Hargrave was stationed 70 yards down the trail, behind a fallen pine, with a clear sight line to the cabin door and his silver-plated revolver in his gloved hands. He had watched Prescott Wade put his men on the ridge and send one up the western approach, and he had stayed where he was told to stay, and he had composed, in his mind, the version of events he would present to the county court in Billings. His wife, in a confused and unstable mental state, had been taken advantage of by a mountain man who had assaulted him in his own home. He had come to retrieve her, at great personal cost and danger, because a husband's duty demanded it. The mountain man had resisted and had been dealt with accordingly. It was a very clean story. Doyle Hargrave was good at clean stories. The first shot came from the ridge, meant for Blaine, who was not where they expected him to be. He had moved before dawn, circling behind the ridge on a route he had scouted months earlier specifically for this contingency, leaving the cabin with Riva in it and the lamp burning to suggest occupation. The shot skipped off the granite overhang above the cabin roof, and Riva, inside, did not move. She heard the man on the western approach before she saw him. His boots on the gravel beside the woodpile, the careful sound of someone trying to be quiet and not quite managing it. The door was on the far side of the cabin from the woodpile. He would come around the corner and see the door and move for it. That was the only route. She stood with her back to the wall beside the door, the Winchester across her chest, both hands steady. The door opened inward. The man who came through it was not Doyle. He was one of Wade's hired men, a weathered figure in a canvas duster, and he stepped into the room and saw the empty lamp-lit space and took one more step inside, and in that step Riva moved. She drove the stock of the rifle into the side of his head. He went down heavily, the way things go down when they're not expecting to, and his rifle went with him. She stood over him while he found his way back to consciousness and looked up at her, and what he saw in her face apparently resolved the question of whether he wanted to press his luck, because he put his hands up. Outside, the situation on the ridge had resolved with somewhat more violence. Blaine came out of the tree line behind the two men on the high ground, with the advantage of knowing exactly where they were, and the encounter was brief and did not go in their favor. Prescott Wade, when he saw both his ridge men put down and the mountain man still standing, made the calculation that experienced men in his line of work make when the arithmetic changes. He had been hired to collect a woman and dispose of a trapper. He had not been hired to die. He put 2 fingers to his hat brim, stepped back into the trees, and was gone, which left Doyle Hargrave alone behind his fallen pine, with his story and his silver revolver, watching the plan disintegrate. He stayed put for longer than he should have. This was the vanity of a certain kind of man, the belief that remaining in position is the same as maintaining control. When he finally heard footsteps approaching through the snow and looked up, it was not Prescott Wade. Riva came around the end of the fallen pine and looked at her husband. He had the revolver up in an instant, hammer-cocked. 4 years of his voice telling her what she was, worthless, inadequate property that had failed to hold its value, gathered in the barrel. His hand was shaking. She noticed that. She had never seen his hand shake before. "You will come back down that mountain with me," Doyle said. His voice had the controlled surface it always had, but underneath the surface, something was moving, something unsteady. "You will come back, and you will tell the court whatever I need you to tell them, and this will all be finished. You don't have a choice, Riva. You have no money, no legal standing, no—" "Doyle," she said. Her voice was steady in a way it had never been in 4 years of marriage. Not the steadiness of suppression, not the steadiness of a woman keeping herself very small. Something different. The steadiness of open ground. "I am not going anywhere with you." He lunged. The revolver came forward, and Riva Hargrave, who had been Riva Caldwell before a desperate man sold her to solve a problem she had not created, who had survived 4 years of calculated cruelty in a house where everyone on the street knew and said nothing, who had climbed a mountain in the dark, with cracked ribs, and come out the other side of a Montana winter as someone Doyle had never had the occasion to meet, brought the Winchester up from the low carry position She had practiced 300 times in the snow-covered clearing above the camp and fired once. The shot took him in the shoulder of his gun arm. He went down. The silver revolver went into the snow. He lay there making sounds that had no dignity in them. The sounds of a man who has never in his life been the smaller creature in an encounter, and cannot process that this is now what he is. Blaine appeared at the tree line. He looked at Doyle in the snow, then at Riva, then at the rifle. He said nothing. "He's not dead," Riva said. "I know, I chose not to." Blaine looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. She handed Blaine the rifle and crouched down beside Doyle, who was looking up at her from the snow with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something that might have been, improbably, surprise. As if he had genuinely not, until this moment, considered that she was capable of making a choice. "You're going to bleed for a while," she said. "And then you're going to go back down to Gray Hollow, and you're going to tell the sheriff that Prescott Wade shot you in the course of a dispute about payment, which I expect is something that can be made to stick if you work at it. And then you are going to leave me alone, because if you send anyone else up that mountain, Doyle, anyone at all, I will not aim for the shoulder." She stood up. She did not wait for his response. 2 weeks later, a man arrived in Gray Hollow from the federal marshal's office in Helena, following a letter that had been sent from an unnamed location in the Bitterroot Range, detailing the conduct of Sheriff Linus Craft, the particulars of Doyle Hargrave's financial arrangements with certain town officials, and the fate of his first wife, Hedda, whose death records the letter suggested might benefit from a second medical opinion. The letter included the names of 6 town residents willing to corroborate certain facts, provided they could be assured of protection from the economic consequences of Hargrave's considerable leverage. Not every name on that list came forward, but enough of them did. Doyle Hargrave's shoulder healed improperly and left him with a restricted range of motion in his right arm for the rest of his life, which affected his handwriting and made signing documents at the bank a deliberate, labored process. He never spoke publicly about what had happened in the Bitterroot in April of 1886. The story he had told about Prescott Wade and the disputed payment had the advantage of being sufficiently murky that no one pressed it, and the disadvantage of being a story that made him look small, which was a cost he apparently found acceptable. The mill continued to operate under new management after the federal investigation concluded. The grain elevator was sold. Sheriff Linus Craft retired early, which is to say he was persuaded to. As for Riva, the mountain kept her in the way of things that belonged to themselves. The camp below the tree line became something more permanent, with a second room added before the following winter, and a kitchen garden scratched into the thin soil of the south-facing slope. She wrote letters again, long ones, to a cousin in Ohio, and eventually to a woman's charitable organization in Helena that had begun doing legal work on behalf of wives in situations similar to the one she had survived. She signed those letters with her name, Riva, just Riva. She had given the Caldwell back to herself and was not interested in any further arrangements. Blaine, for his part, continued to move between the high country and the camp in his seasonal rhythms, coming down from the peaks in November and returning in April, as he always had, except that now there was a lamp lit in the window when he came back down, and a meal on the fire, and someone at the table who looked up when he came in, not with the careful assessment of danger, but simply with the ease of recognition. It is a quiet kind of story, how it ended. No ceremony, no proclamation, no moment of declaration that could be extracted and framed. Just 2 people who had both, in their different ways, been shaped by what the wilderness takes from you and gives back, choosing, without fuss, to share the difficult business of being alive on the same piece of ground. The scorch marks on the pine floorboards in Gray Hollow were eventually covered by a new rug that Doyle's successor put down when he bought the house. Sycamore Street went on producing its sounds of ordinary life. The town found, over time, that it had less money than before and slightly more conscience which is a trade most towns are slow to accept but eventually come to terms with. High above all of it, where the Bitterroot broke the sky in jagged lines, and the spring runoff roared through Bear Creek like a declaration, Reva Hargrave, who had once weighed 94 pounds and prayed for the cold to take her, split firewood in the morning light, the hatchet swinging clean and true, and did not think about what she had survived so much as what she intended to do with the rest of the years she had taken back.